Hey, everybody. A question was posed on social media the other day after the news broke that Kurtzman was out and that all the current Star Trek shows were being basically canceled. And the question was, what are the first things you would do? What are the things you would do if you were handed the keys to Star Trek? And it got me thinking about it and kind of thinking of what I thought of, the kind of, this kind of Kurtzman era Star Trek and what I think I would do if I was put into his place. To say that his era of Trek was flawed would be an understatement. I think it got off on the wrong foot with Discovery, which, you know, I enjoyed enough. It's not my favorite Trek. I really just did not. I never cared for the redesigns of the Klingons or their ships. I thought they were actually quite ugly designs. I just didn't really care for them. I liked some of the ideas they had there, with like this particular batch of, Klingons being essentially religious fanatics and zealots. I thought was interesting, but it really didn't, hit with me. I thought Strange New Worlds was better. I think Lower Decks is probably the fan favorite and standout for everybody. I never watched Prodigy, and I was enjoying Starfleet Academy, but it again, definitely flawed. Hit some of the right notes. It definitely had potential. But again, everything with this era has been, flawed at best. We won't even discuss Section 31. That was the first time where just something Star Trek came out and I had zero interest, like next to none. A grim, dark Star Trek just isn't for me. That just to me is such a just huge departure from what Star Trek is supposed to be, that it just never piqued my interest. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk about what I would do. So one of the first things I would do is I would assemble, much like how Star Wars has a story team, I would assemble basically a Star Trek version of that with some of the better Star Trek authors, as well as people who've been involved with the franchise for long periods of time. Now, this isn't running out and trying to get Shatner involved, nothing like that. But somebody like a Jonathan Frakes, I think, would be a good person to tap to kind of be, be in that group because he has been involved. I think you grab, you try and get Ronald Moore back in, maybe even not full time as part of the group, but maybe you grab Brennan Braga. I don't know. I don't know what he's up to. But, you get a good group of people together that have been involved in Star Trek for a long period of time, who have a core understanding of what Star Trek is kind of supposed to be. That optimism, the exploration, the kind of grander ideas. And so I think that's kind of where you go. Now, one of the first things that I do is I greenlight a show that takes place after the kind of Next Generation, Voyager, Deep Space Nine era. But one of the things that has to happen here is it has to have, and I'm not saying that you have to go in and ape how these shows looked back in the 80s and 90s. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is you need to be able to draw a line. And that is both from a visual standpoint and a musical standpoint. it needs to have a feel that feels like classic Star Trek while still pushing, the show forward. And I think the best way to do that is to take a leap forward, a couple hundred years. And I think you could do some interesting stuff there. One of the next things that I do is we greenlight the first film. And I think what we do with that is finally dip into that kind of lost timeline between the original series and Next Generation. And I think, that is fertile ground to explore. And I think you can do some interesting things. And it's a way that you can kind of have links to both. Because while it's a prequel to the Next Generation, it's a sequel to the original crew. And I think that you can really do some interesting stuff there. Again, two things need to happen with anything that you would do there. And that is, it has to be linked somewhat visually and musically. One of the biggest problems I've had with the way people have been treating franchises lately, and you see this across the board, this isn't just a Star Trek thing, but it's also Star Wars has this problem recently with a lot of the shows and the side story movies. DC has a huge problem, has had a huge problem with this since the Nolan trilogy. Is this whole notion of running, just screaming away from anything that is a hallmark or a touchstone of these movies and these properties. Now, Nolan, you can kind of give a pass to. He was kind of doing his own thing. But everything else is, in one form or another, trying to ape certain things or, take it back to a comic book level or whatever. There are themes that are universal. And if you're going to go in and, make these kind of nostalgia bait movies in a way, you really should be, if there is a trademark theme, if there is music that immediately hits that part of your brain, you should be bringing that in. There's some places, over, the last few years where that ball has been dropped massively. You look at all the marketing for the current He-Man movie that's coming out, and, the He-Man movie looks good. But they're, they're using the theme, but they're playing it in this modern orchestral way, and that show has such a very specific musical language to the way, the scores for the episodes were. And obviously that theme song is iconic. And of course, within minutes of the first full trailer dropping, you had people who already were on YouTube re-uploading it with the cartoon theme song in there. Why not use that? Why did it take a YouTuber to do that? This is a nostalgia bait movie. Why aren't you using those themes and that musical language of the He-Man cartoons in this movie? It's going to be, other than some modern orchestral versions of, using those kind of, late motifs of the He-Man theme. But I seriously doubt it's going to really, hem close enough to the musical language of the cartoon to be close enough to say, oh, okay, they get it, they got it. Now, it doesn't mean that the movie's not going to be good. It's just a weird choice to make. One of the biggest ball drops, I would say, in, these kind of companies running screaming away from the language of the prior films would be the return of Luke Skywalker in The Mandalorian Season 2. I don't even know what that theme was. But it was nothing ever associated with Luke Skywalker. And, realistically, there was no reason not to use any of the themes associated with Luke Skywalker being a badass in the original trilogy. There's no reason not to use any of that. You have multiple, themes that you could have used in that moment or adapted for that moment. But instead, you went with a whole new song that doesn't really, that's been one of my biggest complaints about the scores to a lot of these Star Wars Disney shows, is that they run screaming away from John Williams' iconic themes. And it's not to say that you have to, score it completely with nothing but John Williams music. But I think, if you go back to the 90s, the Shadow of the Empire CD soundtrack for the book that came out, it shows you exactly the model to go with, where you use the themes where they make sense, the actual themes that John Williams wrote, but then you create a score around it that would feel, at home with, his scores for the films. Star Trek, of course, has one of the most iconic, a couple of the most iconic themes. I mean, you have the Jerry Goldsmith themes from the Star Trek The Motion Picture, and then you have the James Horner scores from Star Trek's Wrath of Khan and Search for Spock, which created amazing musical language for Star Trek. And, of course, the Alexander Courage, original TV show themes. And they're nowhere to be found. Starfleet Academy finally brought back the Klingon theme very briefly, and it was a very welcome addition. Very welcome. I believe Picard in season 3 briefly uses the Next Generation version of the Jerry Goldsmith theme, very briefly. But that's the thing. They're very brief. The rest of the music is his background. There's nothing iconic about it. The Batman themes since Danny Elfman or even Elliot Goldsmith. I mean, I would say that the score for Batman Forever is actually quite good. And yeah, it's not Danny Elfman's just iconic theme, but it's up there. The Batman Forever, Batman and Robin theme is quite good and would be welcome in any kind of modern telling. And of course, John Williams' iconic Superman score, which James Gunn used that motif a little bit in the movie, but again, it wasn't the same. It's this modern kind of melancholy, droney, almost self-important, self-serious, heavily weighted version of these themes, instead of these just iconic, bombastic, hype you up, fill you with joy. And these themes should be getting used in these. And definitely you put me in charge of Star Trek, and that's one of the first things I'm doing is saying, use this music. Make sure the musical language fits. I'm old enough to remember when Enterprise came out and how that theme song they chose took everybody out. Like, everybody I talked to back then hated on that theme. We have some nostalgia for it now because it's the last kind of Star Trek that really felt in the same vein as all the Star Trek we had gotten for the past decade, in the late 80s and through the 90s. But still, that theme ain't great, and it certainly isn't a Star Trek theme. And it would have done better to have something that kind of, held to that musical language. So, that's, to me, highly important, as well as making sure that there is visual links, to how the ships look, how the uniforms look, and to make sure that, visually it's hitting those notes. And those are kind of the big things that I would do if you handed me Star Trek. You know, like I said, you create that team and make sure that they're people who actually are steeped in Star Trek. That you know, we aren't just plucking people who, you know, really only have a tentative grasp on it, or are these kind of people who come in and like, oh, I'm going to do my own thing with it. No, people want Star Trek. If you're making Star Trek, make Star Trek. And, you know, again, it's, you know, making sure we're doing the right kinds of projects. Like I said, you know, something that takes place after that kind of, you know, TNG, DS9, Voyager era. You know, is that Star Trek Legacy that everybody's been clamoring for, where it's Seven of Nine having our own ship? I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it is. Maybe it's something totally different, totally unique, something new. You know, where there's references to the past, but it's not beholden to it much in the way that Next Generation did, which I think is probably the better direction to go. Um, and then, of course, the movie slotting in between Next Generation and uh, the original series in that lost era. But you got to maintain those visual links, and you got to make sure that musical language is there, because that's so important when you're making content in these legacy brands. There's a reason they're legacy brands, is they're comfy shoes for people. You know, I use that a lot when talking about bands that I like, where they aren't really doing anything new, they aren't really doing anything inventive, but you can count on them to release something good that is exactly what you expect. And I call them comfy shoes bands. You know, for me, like U2, Iron Maiden, like these are comfy shoe bands. They aren't really doing anything. They aren't reinventing the wheel. AC/DC. I know exactly what I'm going to get with these, and it's going to hit me in that exact right way, because it's going to hit that center of my brain that's like, ah, this is why I listen to these guys. And I think that's the thing when you're stepping into these, and especially if you're stepping into them for the fact that you're just cranking out these things for nostalgia and to try and keep that audience on board, then you got to make sure you're hitting these. I think the only one that really kind of skews away from that a little bit, and where it's had the most problem, is with Star Wars, because I think Star Wars, George Lucas always tried to push it in new and different ways, and it always took people a little bit to get around to it, much like we're seeing now with the prequels. Whereas Disney tried to just basically remake what came before, and it backfired. So, you know, it's a dangerous mix. That's why I said, you know, you got to try and push it forward, but you got to try and push it forward in smart ways. And that's why those are the two eras I picked for the content I would pick if I was in charge. One in the future, one slotted in the the era that we've not seen. So let me know what you think. What would you do if you were put in charge of Star Trek? And I'll see you in the next video.